So I'm going to read to you a little bit from this book here, For the Win, which is my new young adult novel, and it's a book about gold farming. Gold farming is a thing that people do in video games. It's when people undertake to do a repetitive task in a video game, like killing the same crummy monsters over and over again, or doing the same repetitive manufacturing task to turn a sheep into a shirt over and over again, in order to amass virtual wealth that's then sold on to other players who are either too lazy or too busy to do those tasks themselves. It's an improbable thing, but there's about 400,000 people who earn a living doing it today. Most of the people who do the gold farming live in poor countries. Most of the people who buy the virtual gold and stuff live in rich countries. This is a book about what happens when the gold farmers form a trade union. Something that they're able to do under the noses of their bosses, because they're using networks all the time, and all the workers in their sector are in the same virtual world, so they can all talk to each other and they can all organize. And because they're not welcome in the network, because the people who run the games would rather not have them there, they're already skilled in using the network in a way that's very difficult to monitor or surveil. So they have in that a natural tool for doing it. The action in the book is set all over the world, mostly in South China, the big manufacturing cities of Guangzhou and Shenzhen, and in Mumbai, in the largest slum in the east, which is Dharavi, and in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Singapore, and in Los Angeles, the port of Los Angeles. And the bit I'm going to read to you today is about the outbreak of the first wildcat strike among the union. The union's called the Weblies, or the Industrial Workers of the World Wide Web. And after that, I'll take your questions. A short reading, about 10 minutes. Reling had just finished 12 hours of play and had ordered in a tray of pork dumplings and doused them in hot Vietnamese red rooster sauce and chopsticked them into his mouth as fast as he could chew. And now he was ready to relax with some after-work play. For this, he always used his own tune, a char he'd started playing with when he was a boy in Gansu. In some ways, this tune was him. So long had he lived with it, lovingly buffing it, training it, dressing it in the finest of treasures. He had trained up innumerable tunes and seen them sold off, but this one was his. Tonight, Reling partied with some farmers he knew from other parts of China, some of whom he'd known back in the village, some of whom he'd never met in person. They were a ferocious nightly raiding guild, and they pulled off the hardest missions in the world. They were the cream of the crop. Word had gotten round, and now every night he had an audience of players who'd just been hired on, watching in awe as he kicked fantastic quantities of ass. He loved that, loved answering their questions after he was done playing, helping the whole team get better, and they loved that too, and that was just great. So they ran Buri's fortress, the palace of a long-departed god, the father of the gods, the powerful elemental force that had birthed the game of Svartalfheim warriors and the universe in which it lay. It had fearsome guardians, required powerful spells just to reach, and had never been fully run in the whole history of the game. It was just the kind of mission Reling loved to try. This would be his sixth crack at it, and he was prepared to raid for 6 hours straight, if that's what it took, and so was the rest of his party. And then he got Fenrir's tooth. It was the rarest and most legendary drop in all of Svartalfheim warriors, a powerful talisman that would turn any wolf pack or enthrall them to its holder. The message boards had been full of talk about it, and several times there had been fraudulent auctions for it, but no one had ever truly seen it before. After Reling picked it up, it had come from an epic battle with an army of sky giants, in which the entire raiding party had been killed over and over again. He had been so stunned by it that for a moment he couldn't speak. He just pointed at the screen while his mouth opened and shut. The players watching him fell silent too, following his gaze and his finger, slowly realizing what had just happened. A murmur built through the crowd, picking up steam, picking up volume, turning into a roar, a triumphant shout that brought the entire cafe over to see. Over the computer fans' noise, they buzzed excitedly, a hormone-drenched, triumphant tribal chest-beating exercise that swept them all up. Every boy imagined what it would be like to go questing with Fenrir's tooth. Every boy's heart thundered in his chest. But there was another sound, getting louder and more insistent. An older voice, raspy with a million cigarettes, a hard voice. Sit down, back to work, everyone back to work. It was Wang, the foreman, shouting with his fearsome Fujianese accent. He was rumored to be an ex-snakehead, thrown out of the human smuggling gang for killing migrants with his rough treatment. Usually he sat lizard-like and motionless in the corner, smoking a succession of cheap Chinese Class D fake Marlboros, a lazy curl of smoke giving him a permanent squint. Sometimes players would forget that he was there, and their shouting and horseplay would get out of control, and then he would steal up behind them on cat-silent feet and deliver a ringing blow to the ear that would send them reeling. It was enough of an object lesson, don't piss off the snakehead or he'll lay a beating on you, that he hardly ever had to repeat it. Now, though, he was clouting boys left and right, bellowing orders in his loud, hoarse voice. The boys retreated to their computers in a shoving rush, leaving Reeling alone in his seat, an uncertain smile on his face. "Boss," he said, "you see what I've done?" He pointed to his screen. Wang's face was as impassive as ever. He put a hard, heavy hand on Reeling's shoulder and leaned in to read the screen, his head wreathed in smoke. Finally, he straightened. "Fenrir's tooth," he said. "A bonus for you, Reeling. Very good." Reeling shrank back. "Boss," he said, respectfully, speaking loudly to be heard over the computer fence, "Boss, that's my character. I'm not working now. It's my personal character." Wang turned to look at him, his eyes hard and his expression flat. "A bonus," he said again. "Well done." "It's my character," Reeling said, speaking more loudly. "No bonus, it's mine. I earned it personally on my own time." He didn't even see the blow, it was that fast. 1 minute he was hotly declaring that Fenrir's tooth was his. The next he was sprawled on his ass on the ground, his head ringing like a gong. The foreman put one foot on his throat. The man said, "No bonus," clearly and distinctly, so that everyone around could hear. Then he hawked up a huge mouthful of poisonous green spit from the tar-soaked depths of his blackened lungs and carefully spat it in Reeling's face. From the age of 4, Reeling had practiced wushu, training with a man in the village whom all the adults deferred to. The man had been sent north during the Cultural Revolution, denounced and beaten and starved, but had never broken. He was as gentle and patient as a grandmother, and he was as old as the hills, and he could send an attacker flying through the air with a flick of the wrist, break a board with his old hands, kick you into the next life with one ancient gnarled foot. For 12 years, Reeling had gone 3 times a week to train with the old man. All the boys had. It had just been part of life in the village. He hadn't practiced since he came to South China, had all but forgotten that relic of a different land. But now he remembered every lesson, remembered it deep in his muscles. He gripped the ankle of the foot that was on his throat, twisted just slightly to gain maximum leverage, and applied a small controlled bit of pressure and threw the foreman into the air, sending him sailing in a perfect, graceful arc that terminated when his head cracked against the side of one of the long trestle tables, knocking it over and sending a dozen flat screens tumbling to the ground, the noise audible over the hum of the fans. Reeling stood carefully and faced the foreman. The man was groaning on the ground, and Reeling couldn't keep the small grin off his face. That had felt good. He found that he was standing in the ready stance, weight balanced evenly on each foot, feet spread for stability, body side on to the man on the ground, presenting a smaller target. His hands were loosely held up, one before the other, ready to catch a punch and lock the arm and throw the attacker, ready to counterstrike high or low. The boys around him were cheering, chanting his name, and Reeling smiled more broadly. The foreman picked himself up off the floor, no expression at all on his face, a terrible blankness, and Reeling felt his first inkling of fear. Something about how the man held himself as he stood, not anything like the stance in the martial arts games they played in the village, something altogether more serious. Reeling heard a high, whining noise and realized it was coming from his own throat. He lowered his hand slightly, extended one in a friendly, palm-up way. "Come on now," he said. "Let's be adults about this." And that's when the foreman reached under the shoulder of his ill-fitting, rumpled, dander-speckled suit jacket and pulled out a cheap little pistol, pointed it at Reeling, and shot him square in the forehead. Even before Reeling hit the ground, one eye open, the other shut, the boys around him began to roar. The foreman had 1 second to register the sound of 100 voices rising in anger before the boys boiled over, clambering over one another to reach him. Too late, he tried to tighten his finger on the trigger of the gun he'd carried ever since leaving behind Fujian province all those years before. By then, 3 boys had fastened themselves to his arm and had forced it down so that the gun was aiming into the meat of his old thigh, and the .22 slug he squeezed off drilled itself into the big femur before flattening on the shattered bone, spreading out like a lead coin. When he opened his mouth to scream, fingers found their way into his cheeks, tearing at them, even as other hands twined themselves in his hair, fastened themselves to his feet and his arms, even yanked at his ears. Someone punched him hard in the balls twice, and he couldn't breathe around the hands in his mouth, couldn't scream as he tumbled down. The gun was wrenched from his hand at the same instant that 2 fists drilled into his eyes, and then it was dark and painful and infinite, a moment that stretched off into his unconsciousness and then into annihilation. Thank you.